October 25th, 1415. Dawn breaks over a muddy field in northern France. On one side stands the flower of French chivalry, thousands of armored knights and men-at-arms confident of a quick victory. Opposite them, across a narrow stretch of churned earth, a smaller English army led by King Henry V waits in grim silence. The French are so sure of triumph that some joke about the ransoms they'll collect from English nobles. They laugh at the ragged English longbowmen facing them, dismissing these common archers as no threat to armored knights. Yet by sunset, that muddy field will be heaped with French bodies. The mighty knightly charge will falter in the mire, and the useless longbows will cut down the cream of French nobility like flies. This is the story of the Battle of Agincourt, an upset victory that changed the course of the 100 Years' War. Claim to understand how Agincourt came about? We need the backdrop of the 100 Years' War. This was a long, intermittent conflict between England and France that began in 1337, spanning multiple generations of kings. At its core was a dispute over who should be king of France and over English-held territories in France. Decades earlier, English armies had won famous battles at Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, thanks in part to the English longbow decimating French knights. Those victories gave England significant gains, but war fortunes shifted back and forth. By 1415, a fragile truce had held for some years. In England, young King Henry V had just come to power, crowned 1413. Henry V was an ambitious and determined monarch with a pedigree tied to France. He, like his great-grandfather Edward III, claimed the French crown by lineage. France, however, already had a king, Charles VI, but Charles was frequently incapacitated by mental illness. The French realm was bitterly divided between rival factions of nobles, notably the Armagnacs and Burgundians, vying for control. Sensing opportunity, Henry V decided to renew England's fight in France. He demanded the French crown or extensive lands as the price for peace, terms the French would not accept. For Henry, war served multiple aims: to secure his claims abroad and to cement his legitimacy and prestige at home with a bold victory. Thus, in August 1415, Henry V launched an invasion of France, reigniting the 100 Years' War after years of uneasy peace. He arrived with a well-prepared army and a resolve to press English claims by force. Henry V's campaign in France, 1415. Henry's first objective was the fortified port of Harfleur in Normandy, the key to Normandy, whose capture would provide a base and supply port. In late summer 1415, the English army landed in northern France, some sources say around 10,000 to 12,000 strong at the outset, and laid siege to Harfleur. The town was well defended with thick walls, and the siege dragged on for nearly 5 weeks in the sweltering late summer. Harfleur finally fell on September 22, 1415, but the victory came at a high cost. The protracted siege and unsanitary camp conditions ravaged Henry's army. Disease, especially dysentery, ran rampant. Hundreds of English soldiers died or became gravely ill, and many others were wounded from the fighting. By the time Harfleur surrendered, Henry's army was severely weakened. Some estimates suggest he lost as much as half his force to battle casualties and sickness. Henry left a garrison to hold the newly captured town, and he even sent many sick and wounded soldiers home to England. Summer was ending, and campaigning in medieval times was difficult in autumn weather. Henry had achieved one goal by taking Harfleur, but he now faced a dilemma. He could halt the campaign and sail back to England from Harfleur, having won a modest victory. But that might seem like an anticlimax and could invite French attempts to quickly retake Harfleur. Alternatively, he could make a bold show of force by marching his remaining army across France to the English-held port of Calais to the northeast. Calais was under English control, and reaching it would allow his army to winter safely or return to England by sea from there. Henry, confident and seeking to demonstrate that he could move freely through French territory, chose the bolder course. Despite his army's weakened state, he would march to Calais overland through enemy territory. In early October 1415, Henry V led his reduced army, perhaps around 6,000 men remaining, out of Harfleur and struck out northeast across the French countryside. This march was a calculated risk, a demonstration of English resolve, but it was also fraught with peril. The distance to Calais was roughly 150 miles, 240 kilometers, and the English would be trudging through hostile territory, low on provisions, and with many soldiers still suffering from illness. Henry's men were indeed in rough shape. Chronicles mention many were weakened by dysentery, forcing some to cut off the bottoms of their tunics or armor to cope with their illness during the march. Exhaustion and hunger grew with each passing day. Meanwhile, the French were not idle. News of the fall of Harfleur and the English march galvanized the French nobility. France's leaders gathered a large feudal army to intercept Henry before he could reach the safety of Calais. Under the nominal command of the French constable, Charles d'Albret, and other prominent nobles like Marshal Jean Boucicaut, the French forces began to shadow Henry's route. Their strategy was to block the English path, corner them, and force a battle on French terms. Importantly, King Charles VI of France was not present. His illness kept him away. So command fell to his nobles, primarily of the Armagnac faction. These French lords were eager to crush the English invader and avenge the embarrassment of Harfleur, and perhaps to emulate the great French victories of the past, or erase the shame of defeats like Crécy. As the French mustered, their numbers swelled far beyond Henry's. Exact figures are debated, but by most accounts, the French army that moved to confront Henry was several times larger than the English force. Henry's march became a desperate race. The French blocked the most convenient route. They secured all the main bridges and fords on the Somme River, which Henry needed to cross. Denied the direct crossings, Henry had to lead his troops on a forced detour inland, marching upriver, southward and eastward, for many miles to find an unguarded crossing. This delay allowed even more French forces to rally and pursue him. By October 19th, Henry finally found a small ford near a village, Betancourt, and managed to get his army across the Somme. Having outmaneuvered the immediate French bloc, the English turned northward again, toward Calais. By now, however, the French army was closing in fast. They were maneuvering ahead of Henry, intent on cutting him off. After over 2 weeks of exhausting marching, Henry's weary troops neared the village of Agincourt, in northern France. On October 24, 1415, scouts brought grim news. A large French force had positioned itself directly across the English line of advance. The road to Calais was now barred by thousands of French troops. Henry's army, exhausted, hungry, and now trapped against a far superior enemy, had little choice but to stand and fight. The eve of battle. Agincourt, October 24th, 1415. On the night of October 24th, the two armies made camp within striking distance of each other, near the village of Agincourt. Rain poured down that night, a cold autumn rain that turned the recently plowed fields between the woods of Tremecourt and Azincourt into a quagmire. The stage was set for the next day's battle on a narrow strip of open land hemmed in by forest on one side and soggy low ground on the other. The mood in the two camps could not have been more different. In the English camp, King Henry V tried to steel the resolve of his vastly outnumbered men. The English knew they faced disaster. By many accounts, Henry's army was outnumbered at least 2 to 1, and some say as much as 4 or 5 to 1. Many English soldiers were weak from dysentery and days of marching on meager rations. They could see the glow of French campfires and hear the sounds of a much larger enemy force. According to chroniclers, Henry had his men pray and confess before battle, as was customary when a fight to the death seemed likely. He also addressed his army, trying to inspire them. One recorded line attributed to Henry by French sources was especially blunt and effective. He reminded his men that if they lost, noble knights might be captured and ransomed as prisoners of war. But the common archers and infantry would likely be killed on the spot. In other words, there was no choice but to fight like their lives depended on it, because they did. In the French camp, the atmosphere was confident, even boastful. Here was an army full of France's high nobility, seasoned knights, wealthy lords, proud men-at-arms, the elite of French society. They had the English trapped and outnumbered, and they expected to win handily in the morning. Many French nobles anticipated a grand day of battle, with rich rewards in ransom from any high-ranking English captured. Contemporary accounts describe French knights jostling over positions, debating who would get the honor of charging first or capturing King Henry himself. There was likely feasting and bravado. Some veteran leaders, like Constable d'Albret, urged caution and proper strategy to minimize casualties. After all, they knew the English longbows had been deadly in previous battles. But the overconfidence among the French was pervasive. They believed overwhelming force and knightly valor would carry the day. So sure were they of victory that they delayed any night attack, preferring to crush the English in a proper battle in daylight. According to some sources, the French nobility even refused to consider alternatives like using their crossbowmen or waiting longer. They saw it as their chivalric duty to engage the English knights head-on and swiftly end this encounter. Thus, through the rainy night, Henry's men prepared grimly, hungry and anxious, but determined. The French waited eagerly, confident and perhaps complacent. The scene was set for a showdown at Agincourt come morning. The armies at Agincourt, England versus France. As dawn broke on October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day as it happened, the two forces began to deploy for battle on the muddy field. Henry V's English army was small but efficiently organized. Estimates of its size vary, but a common figure is around 6,000 to 8,000 men. Out of these, the vast majority were archers armed with the longbow. Perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 were English and Welsh longbowmen. Some chronicles say about 4 out of every 5 soldiers in Henry's army were archers. The remainder, roughly 800 to 1,000 men, were men-at-arms, armored knights, nobles, and their retainers fighting primarily on foot. Henry himself, as king, fought on foot among his men-at-arms in the center. Mounted knights were of little use in a defensive stance on muddy ground. These English men-at-arms would have been clad in plate armor, steel breastplates, helmets, gauntlets, and greaves, and armed with swords, axes, spears, or polearms. The longbowmen, by contrast, were more lightly equipped. Many had minimal armor, perhaps a padded gambeson jacket, maybe a helmet or bits of mail, which, though offering less protection, meant they were far more mobile in mud than a fully armored knight. Each archer carried a 6-foot longbow made of yew wood, a supply of arrows, tipped with bodkin points for punching through armor or broadheads for unarmored targets, and often a sidearm like a short sword or maul. Henry arrayed his forces in a defensive formation. He positioned his men-at-arms in the center in a solid block, and he stationed his longbowmen on the flanks and slightly forward in wedges or wings that angled out. This arrangement meant that any attacking French would likely envelop themselves between the converging fields of archery fire. To protect the archers from cavalry charges, Henry's men cut wooden stakes, sharpened poles, and drove them into the ground at an angle in front of the longbowmen's positions. This innovation, an English adaptation not used at Crécy or Poitiers, created a crude but effective fence of spikes, which could impale charging horses or at least force any cavalry to shy away and slow down. The archers set these stakes in the soft earth during the morning as they prepared for battle. Henry's battle line thus bristled with sharpened stakes at the flanks and was anchored by dense woods to left and right, limiting any flanking maneuvers. The English had effectively made a fortified killing zone in front of their line. Facing them, the French army formed up with a vast numerical advantage. The French force likely numbered anywhere from 12,000 to 20,000 men, or more depending on which account. Many say the French outnumbered the English by at least 3 or 4 to 1. Whatever the exact number, it was a large feudal army, meaning it was composed of multiple noblemen's retinues and levies. At its core were thousands of knights and men-at-arms, the armored nobility of France, including dukes, counts, and lesser lords, each with their own followers. Many of these knights were mounted cavalry by tradition, but for this battle a substantial portion dismounted to fight on foot, expecting to engage the English men-at-arms directly. Still, the French did have groups of mounted knights and cavalry units positioned forward as well. They intended to use some cavalry at the outset, particularly to try to scatter the English archers. In addition to the nobility, the French had contingents of infantry and militia. Some were local levies with crude weapons, and crucially, they had crossbowmen and archers too. However, in the hierarchy of the French army, these missile troops were considered lower status. Accounts suggest that the French crossbowmen and archers were placed toward the rear or edges of the formation, not front and center. French leadership, dominated by proud knights, seemingly had little interest in making the archers a central part of their battle plan, an omission that would prove costly. The French battle formation was traditional. They arranged themselves in 3 battles or lines, one behind the other. The first line, the vanguard, consisted of many of the highest-ranking knights and men-at-arms, hundreds of lords, including the Constable d'Albret, himself and other luminaries. Many of these first-line knights decided to fight on foot, anticipating closing with the English. Flanking this line or intermingled with it were to be the mounted cavalry units whose job was to charge ahead early and disrupt the English archers. The second line was another mass of men-at-arms, knights, and supporting troops, ready to advance once the first line engaged. A third line behind them included the rest of the forces, potential reserves. including additional men-at-arms and those archers, crossbowmen that were present. In theory, with such depth and numbers, the French planned to simply overrun the English by sheer force. The first line would engage and pin them, the second would add weight and break through, and the third, if needed, would mop up any remaining resistance. However, this grand plan did not fully account for the terrain and the English tactics. The field between the two armies was only a few hundred yards wide at the front, significantly narrowed by the flanking woods. This meant the huge French army had to pack itself into a limited front to attack, negating some of their numerical advantage. Only so many men could fight side by side. The ground, soaked by the overnight rain, had become a thick, clinging mud, especially where freshly plowed fields lay in the low ground. The French knights in heavy armor would have to cross this sticky, mucky field under fire. In contrast, the lightly equipped English archers would be relatively nimble. These conditions and the funnel-like terrain were going to play a decisive role in what followed. Agincourt begins. The English provoke the attack. Morning stretched on, and for a while neither side rushed to attack. The English were greatly outnumbered and stood in a defensive stance, so they had no incentive to move first. The French, for their part, had the numbers and a superior position blocking the road. They could have delayed, forcing Henry to attack or even simply containing him until hunger and disease further weakened the English. Some historians suggest the French commanders may have considered waiting Henry out, but the prevailing mood among the French nobility was aggressive and overconfident. They expected to smash the English in open battle that day, so initially the French line stood ready but did not immediately charge. There may have also been minor delays in the French camp. Some accounts mention French knights debating tactics or waiting for more units to arrive, or even that some knights wandered off to have breakfast or tend their horses, not expecting the English to charge. King Henry V realized that a static standoff would not favor his smaller army. If the French didn't attack, his situation would only worsen with time. So Henry made a calculated move to provoke the French into action. Sometime mid-morning, around 11 a.m. according to some sources, Henry ordered his banners to advance and moved his army forward a short distance, closing the gap between the two forces. The English troops edged further into the open, and crucially, into effective longbow range of the French lines. Then Henry's longbowmen let fly a sudden volley of arrows, inaugurating the battle. This sudden forward surge by the outnumbered English and the rain of arrows that followed goaded the French into commencing their attack rather than holding back. Thousands of arrows whistled through the air, arcing toward the densely packed French lines. The sky literally darkened with a storm of arrows. This opening barrage unnerved the French and inflicted the first casualties. Horses reared up or fell as arrows struck. Unarmored attendants and lesser troops in front ranks were hit. The French had little choice now but to charge or fall back, and retreat was unthinkable for the proud knights. Thus, the French assault began. The French charge and the longbows' lethal effect stung by the arrow volleys, the French launched their attack. Mounted knights and cavalry on the flanks were the first to move. A contingent of French knights on horseback lowered lances and galloped forward, aiming to ride down the troublesome English archers on the wings. They likely hoped to scatter the archers quickly, opening the way for the main body to advance safely. However, this cavalry charge was doomed from the start. Between the woods narrowing the field and the chevaux de frise of pointed stakes the English archers had planted, there was no easy approach to outflank or trample the archers. As the French cavalry thundered forward, they came under withering arrow fire. Longbowmen could release 6 to 10 arrows per minute, and with thousands of archers, the air was thick with missiles. Horses, even armored war horses, were particularly vulnerable. Many were hit in the chest, neck, or flanks by arrows. Panicked, wounded horses threw their riders or veered off. Some chargers did reach the English lines but were impaled on the stakes or forced to shy away, losing all momentum. English archers, safe behind their stakes, shot point-blank at horsemen that got close. Within minutes, this cavalry assault collapsed in bloody chaos. Riderless horses, some maddened by pain, galloped back through the advancing French infantry ranks, scattering men and adding to the confusion. French survivors of the charge who could still control their mounts likely retreated in disarray. The initial attempt to silence the longbows ended in disaster for the French, and the muddy field was churned up even more by the hooves and fleeing horses. Now the main French infantry advance began. The corps of French knights and men-at-arms on foot, forming a great mass of armored men. They moved forward across the mucky field, determined to engage Henry's line. Thousands of French foot knights, shoulder to shoulder, began trudging through mud that could suck the boots off one's feet. They carried heavy armor. A full suit of plate could weigh 50 to 60 pounds, and many had their visors down and heads lowered to protect against the arrow storm. This posture, necessary to guard the face's weak points, unfortunately limited their breathing and vision. Still, they pressed on, a wall of steel advancing. The English archers increased their rate of fire, shooting at closest range possible now. Arrows hailed down incessantly. Could arrows penetrate plate armor? The best quality steel armors of French knights were largely proof against arrows at long range on direct hit to the chest or helmet. But not every soldier had top-quality armor. Many had iron or thinner steel in places. Moreover, the archers aimed for weak spots, gaps in armor at armpits, visors, leg joints, and at less protected targets. And even when arrows didn't pierce armor, they struck with blunt force. Men were knocked back or wounded in limbs. At the very least, the psychological effect was harrowing. Under this terrifying hail of arrows, French soldiers began to fall, some wounded, others dead. The advancing line bunched closer together instinctively, each man wanting the protection of his fellow's shield or armor as arrows rained. That tightening formation would prove fatal. As the first French battle, the vanguard, struggled forward, the mud became their enemy. The ground, churned by the earlier cavalry and now trampled by thousands of feet, turned into a clinging morass. Every step was laborious. Knights sank ankle-deep, even knee-deep in spots, in mud that sucked at their legs. They grew exhausted very quickly, lugging their heavy armor and weapons. Arrow strikes felled some, and once a man-at-arms fell in that press, it was incredibly hard to get back up. Men who slipped or were knocked down were trampled by those behind or drowned in mud if injured. The French advance slowed to a creep as they came within a few tens of yards of the English. By the time the first French knights finally closed with the English line, they were breathing hard, fatigued, and disorganized. The narrowing of the field meant that only a portion of the huge French force could actually come into contact with the enemy at once. Others behind them just pushed forward, squeezing the front ranks further. The French reached the English men-at-arms in the center and crashed into their line, initiating brutal hand-to-hand combat. Henry V's men-at-arms, though far fewer, stood their ground ferociously. Meanwhile, the English archers on the flanks, having loosed most of their arrows, were not passive observers. Once their arrows were largely expended, the longbowmen dropped their bows and joined the fight. They were light-footed and agile compared to the armored knights. Many archers were armed with mallets, hatchets, swords, or daggers. Some even took up discarded French weapons from the field. They swarmed in from the sides and rear of the stalled French vanguard. The melee that ensued was horrific and bloody. French knights found themselves assaulted from the front by English men-at-arms and harried at their flanks by swarms of archers hacking and clubbing at them. In the cramped space, the French couldn't swing their swords effectively. They could barely raise their arms in the crush of bodies. The sheer mass of men behind kept pushing new fighters into the fray, but that only intensified the congestion at the front. One chronicle described the French formation as so tightly packed that the men could scarcely lift their weapons to strike. Many French knights were literally stuck in place, pressed by their own ranks, and systematically cut down. Those who fell were trampled and suffocated under piles of fellow soldiers. As one observer put it, it was like a human bottleneck. All advantage of French numbers was lost, and it became an awful grind of attrition favoring the lighter, more mobile English. In this chaos, King Henry V himself entered the fray with his household guard. The king fought hand-to-hand, wielding a weapon, likely a poleaxe or sword, and reportedly even took a blow to the head that cracked the crown on his helmet. At one point, Henry's younger brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was felled and wounded. Henry stood over him, defending him until Humphrey could be dragged to safety. Henry's presence inspired his men. Their king was risking his life beside them, and they would not let him be captured or killed. The English line, though outnumbered, refused to break. Under relentless pressure, the French first line collapsed. Dozens of French lords were struck down or taken prisoner in this furious melee. The English archers and men-at-arms carved through the incapacitated enemy. Entire contingents of the French vanguard were annihilated or surrendered. In fact, the English began taking many high-born prisoners, since capturing and ransoming nobles was a standard and lucrative practice in medieval warfare. Great heaps of bodies piled up where the fighting was fiercest, especially in front of the English center and at the flanks where archers had encircled the enemy. It was an incredible outcome. This first wave of French might, which had expected to roll over the English, was effectively destroyed at Henry's feet. Yet, the battle was not over. The second French line was now coming in. Fresh knights and men-at-arms from the rear moved up, determined to crush the exhausted English. They too had to cross the same muddy death trap, under continuing arrow fire. Some archers had recovered arrows from the ground or reserves from supply and kept shooting as the second line advanced. The second wave met the same fate. By the time they engaged, they were already disordered and fatigued, climbing over ground littered with the dead and wounded from the first wave. They added their own bodies to the carnage. For a while, a brutal back-and-forth struggle continued, the English fighting off successive French rushes. But eventually, French cohesion broke completely. Many of the leaders of the second line were killed or captured just like those in the first. The survivors' will to continue evaporated as they realized the battle was lost. A third French line or reserve still remained at the back, including various lords who had not yet fought and detachments of late arrivals. This third group saw the disaster unfolding ahead. The field was clogged with thousands of dead or dying French knights, and the English remained unbroken and defiant. At the same time, a sudden alarm came from the English rear. A band of local French peasants and a few mounted men, possibly led by a minor noble, had attacked the English baggage camp, seeking plunder. Tents were set on fire, and some of Henry's personal treasures, even a crown, were stolen in this raid. For a moment, the English feared they were being attacked from behind, and that fresh French forces had ambushed them. King Henry, amid the confusion, faced a dire situation. He now held hundreds of French prisoners, more than his own army's remaining strength, and a still large third French force hovered on the field. If those prisoners were allowed to live and the battle resumed, they could rearm themselves or overpower their guards from within. In an agonizing decision, Henry V ordered that most of the French prisoners be killed immediately. This was a highly unusual and ruthless action against the chivalric code. Prisoners, especially knights, were valuable for ransom. Many English knights were appalled and refused to carry out the killings, both for honor and profit motives. So Henry enlisted lower-ranking soldiers, archers and others, to do it. These men, less encumbered by chivalric conventions, proceeded to slaughter many of the defenseless French captives. The grim task was likely only partially completed before it became clear that the French third line had no stomach to renew the fight. Indeed, witnessing the carnage and panic, the remaining French began to flee the battlefield. Henry soon called off the prisoner executions once the immediate threat subsided, but by then hundreds of prisoners might have been slain. Historians debate how many were killed. Whether dozens or a couple hundred, it was enough to leave a dark footnote on Henry's victory. When the dust settled by midday, the Battle of Agincourt was over. Against all odds, King Henry V and his men had defeated the vastly larger French army. The French first and second lines were effectively wiped out. The field was a horrifying vista of armor-clad bodies, broken arrows, and mud drenched in blood. Some accounts say the battle lasted only about 3 hours. Others suggest even less, perhaps as short as an hour or so of intense fighting followed by pursuit and cleanup. Aftermath and outcome. The scale of the French defeat at Agincourt was staggering. Although exact casualty figures were not recorded with precision, it's estimated that several thousand French soldiers were killed that day. Commonly cited numbers are around 5,000 to 6,000 dead, and some sources claim even more. Among the French dead lay a disproportionate number of nobles and knights, the cream of France's warrior class. Dozens of high-ranking lords perished. In the carnage were found the bodies of 3 dukes, including the Duke of Alençon, who had nearly reached King Henry in combat before being killed, numerous counts, and scores of bannerets and knights. Entire noble families were bereaved of their heirs in one day's fight. One chronicler noted the list of fallen French nobles read like a roll call of the great houses of France. In addition to the dead, hundreds of French nobles were taken prisoner, at least those fortunate enough not to be killed on Henry's order. Surviving captives included the Duke of Orléans, a prince of the blood royal, the Duke of Bourbon, and many other distinguished men who would later be ransomed for hefty sums. English losses, by every account, were astonishingly low by comparison. Some contemporary English sources claimed only a few dozen fatalities on their side, which might be an underestimate. Modern estimates suggest the English might have lost in the low hundreds at most. A frequently cited figure is around 300 to 400 English dead, though some French sources at the time insisted it was higher. Notably, among the English fallen were Edward, Duke of York, a close royal relative of Henry, and Michael de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, so even a small number of losses included some important men. Still, the English army remained largely intact and victorious. As the reality of the victory set in, King Henry V surveyed a field that by all expectations should have marked his doom, but instead was the site of his greatest triumph. The implications were enormous. Immediately after the battle, Henry had the French heralds formally name the battlefield Agincourt, after the nearby castle of Agincourt, cementing its place in history. Henry and his weary, victorious army did not linger long. They gathered what spoils they could, rounded up the remaining prisoners, and resumed their march to Calais. Now there was no French army to block them. The English reached Calais in early November and soon crossed the Channel back to England. On November 23, 1415, Henry V made a triumphal entry into London. The news of Agincourt had preceded him, and he was greeted as a national hero. The English public, starved for a great victory after decades of prior disappointments, erupted in celebration. Henry rode into the city to the pealing of church bells and adulation, with captured French banners carried in procession. Poets and songs praised him as the favored monarch who won against God's odds. Indeed, many in England saw the win as a sign of divine favor, given it fell on St. Crispin's Day. The victory also solidified Henry's legitimacy as king. His father Henry IV had taken the throne in a coup, and the Lancastrian claim was not uncontested, but now Henry V's glory cast his dynasty in a golden light. For France, the defeat at Agincourt was a catastrophe. In one day, the Armagnac faction lost a generation of experienced leaders. The French nobility was deeply shaken and humbled. The immediate political fallout saw the rival Burgundian faction gain advantage in the French civil strife, as they blamed the Armagnacs for the debacle. This internal disarray meant France was ill-prepared to resist when Henry V renewed his invasion a few years later. Indeed, Agincourt paved the way for Henry to undertake a systematic conquest of Normandy in 1417 to 1419. Ultimately, it led to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a humiliating agreement for France in which the French King Charles VI acknowledged Henry V as his heir and gave Henry his daughter Catherine in marriage. For a brief moment, it appeared Henry V might become king of both England and France. That outcome was cut short when Henry V died unexpectedly in 1422, but Agincourt set all these events in motion. In the long run, France would recover and the 100 Years' War would swing back in France's favor, thanks to figures like Joan of Arc later on. But Agincourt stands as a monumental English victory, a battle that crippled French military power in the short term and became legendary in the English-speaking world. It has been immortalized in songs, literature, most famously Shakespeare's Henry V with its rousing St. Crispin's Day speech, and countless history books as a classic underdog triumph. Why the English won despite being outnumbered? How did Henry V's outnumbered, exhausted army defeat a French force of such superior size and apparent strength? The outcome at Agincourt was the product of several critical factors. Leadership and discipline. Henry V proved to be an exceptional leader on the field. He made shrewd tactical decisions, choosing the battlefield terrain wisely, using a defensive stance, and even daring to advance to provoke the enemy at the right moment. He maintained strict discipline among his troops, for example, ordering archers to prepare stakes and hold positions. Henry's personal courage, fighting in the front ranks, also inspired his men to give their utmost. On the other side, the French leadership was fragmented. There was no single unified command. Various nobles argued and vied for honor. This lack of coordination and clear strategy severely undermined the effective use of their superior numbers. Terrain and conditions. The geography of the battlefield heavily favored the defense. The narrow field hemmed in by woods meant the French could never deploy their full width or execute flanking maneuvers. Their numerical advantage was largely neutralized. They were forced into a narrow front and deep columns, which created a crowd that became unmanageable. Moreover, the muddy ground from the prior rains turned the French advance into a slow slog. Fully armored knights sank and slipped, exhausting themselves and breaking formation. In contrast, the lightly armored English archers could move more freely on that terrain. Essentially, the French army's greatest strengths, heavy cavalry charges and massed nightly assaults, were negated by the soft, constricting ground at Agincourt. Tactics and the longbow. The English game plan brilliantly leveraged their strengths, particularly the longbow. The English longbowmen were the battle's MVPs. By planting stakes to ward off cavalry and positioning archers on the flanks, Henry created killing zones where arrows could wreak havoc on any approaching force. The longbows had a long range and a high rate of fire. The continuous volleys of arrows disrupted the French charges from the outset, injuring men and horses, sowing panic, and forcing the attacking knights to keep visors down and heads lowered. Even when arrows couldn't pierce top-quality armor, they still inflicted pain, confusion, and casualties on lesser-armored soldiers and horses. The storm of arrows broke the momentum of the French assaults before they ever reached the English line. By the time combat was hand-to-hand, the French were already in disarray. Additionally, once in melee, the archers proved effective light infantry, swarming the weary knights. In short, English tactical innovations, stakes defense, concentrated longbow fire, positioning, combined with the sheer volume of arrow fire gave Henry's army a decisive edge. French errors and overconfidence. The French defeat can also be attributed to their own mistakes. They were overconfident to the point of rashness. In their eagerness to crush Henry, they attacked in a way that played into the English strengths. The French ignored their own archers and crossbowmen, who might have dueled the English archers or softened the English line. Instead, the French nobility, seeking glory, insisted on traditional knightly charges. They launched frontal assaults across terrible terrain without a cohesive plan beyond break the enemy by courage and force. The initial cavalry charge was ill-conceived and ended up disordering their own ranks. The successive waves of French knights only compounded the congestion and chaos. Essentially, French arrogance, a belief that superior knightly valor would carry the day, led them to underestimate the longbows in the conditions. They repeated the same type of headlong attack that had failed at Crécy and Poitiers, with similarly disastrous results. Morale and motivation. Finally, the morale of the armies played a role. The English were literally fighting for survival. They knew defeat meant death or worse. That desperation can steel men's nerves. Meanwhile, the French were assured of victory and less cautious as a result. When the battle turned against them, that confidence quickly turned to panic. The English, despite exhaustion and illness, maintained cohesion and fighting spirit, whereas the French, once things went awry, the cavalry, repulsed, the first line cut down, fell into disarray and despair. In summary, the English won at Agincourt by exploiting their archery and defensive tactics to the fullest, by capitalizing on terrain and weather, and by standing firm while the French effectively defeated themselves with tactical blunders. It was a perfect storm of English preparedness and valor meeting French overconfidence and misfortune. Conclusion. A battle for the ages. The Battle of Agincourt has resonated through history as a testament to how strategy, technology, and tenacity can overcome overwhelming odds. The image of common English archers cutting down waves of proud French knights is often seen as symbolic of a changing era, the rise of ranged firepower and infantry over the dominance of heavy feudal cavalry. While that is something of an oversimplification, it is true that Agincourt, like Crécy and Poitiers before it, showcased the lethal effectiveness of disciplined longbowmen and the importance of choosing one's battlefield wisely. In the end, what unfolded on that muddy field in 1415 was not luck alone, but a combination of planning, courage, and yes, French folly. The French laughed at the notion that peasant archers could beat noble knights, until those knights fell like flies under arrow and mallet. Agincourt was a bitter lesson to France and a shining moment for England. King Henry V's stunning victory against the odds became legendary, celebrated in England as proof that God and right were on their side, and remembered in France as a day of chivalric tragedy.